Chapter 1, Introduction to Statistics. In section 1.1, we're going to be discussing statistical and critical thinking. The process in conducting a statistical study consists of preparing, analyzing, and concluding. So the preparation involves determining what type of sampling method you're going to use, the study you're going to conduct, how you're going to get your data, what data you're going to collect, and what question are you trying to answer by collecting the data. And then you're going to analyze the data. So that involves creating graphs, exploring, using some type of calculation, whether it's measures of center, variation. Maybe you're going to take that sample and make some inferences about the population. Therefore, basically, you're going to look at the data analysis that you've done, and you're going to make some conclusions based on that data. Critical thinking and making sense of the results is the key to really understanding how statistics can be used to help you make decisions. Statistics is the science of planning studies and experiments, getting the data, organizing it, summarizing it, presenting it. That's where the graphs and tables come in. Analyzing it, making, providing some calculations based on the things you're looking for in the data, and then making an interpretation or interpreting the data so that you can draw conclusions based on them. What we're going to cover in this section is just a real brushstroke overview of preparing the data, analyzing the data, and then conclusions about the data. So the first part is to prepare. You need to know where your data comes from. So what does the data represent? What is your population? What are you trying to determine based on your study? What is it? What question are you trying to answer? And then the source of the data, again, that's very important to know where your data comes from. Is there any bias in the data collection process? So you look for certain things like, is it a voluntary response sample? Is there a particular company that's funding the collection of the data and they have some type of interest above and beyond just a general interest in the data? And then what kind of sampling method are you using? Again, that comes back to, is it voluntary participation or is it data that's collected in an unbiased way that's going to be representative of the population? Data is the collection of observations. It could be measurements, it could be genders, it could be the survey responses, yes, no, values on a Likert scale, 1 through 5, or any other kind of information that you collect from participants. Population is the complete collection of all measurements or data being considered. It's typically a population that's the complete collection of data that we would like to make inferences about. If you collect data from all members of the population, you have a census, which is what the U.S. government tries to do every 10 years, is to collect census data by surveying all the household members in the United States about income level and number of members in the family, if they rent or own, and just it seems almost very intrusive in a lot of respects if you've ever had someone talk about the census or you've been involved in a census in the past. Most of the time, we don't collect census data. What we do is collect a sample, which is a sub-collection of the members of a population. And that's usually because of time and effort and logistics of trying to conduct a census, it's just almost impossible. So we select a part of the population that we call a sample, and we use that data to prepare, analyze, and make conclusions. And we have some level of confidence that that sample represents the population if the data is collected in an unbiased way. So here's an example. We're going to identify the population and the sample from this particular scenario. So it's residential carbon monoxide detectors. In the journal article, Residential Carbon Monoxide Detector Failure Rates in the U.S., it was stated that there are 38 million carbon monoxide detectors installed in the United States. When 30 of them were randomly selected and tested, it was found that 12 of them failed to provide an alarm in hazardous carbon monoxide conditions. Remember, we are trying to identify the population and the sample included in this scenario. So read through it again. Think about population is the big group that we're targeting, and then a sample is part of that big group. See if you can figure out which information in here gives us the population and which information in here gives us the sample. If you had said the 38 million carbon monoxide detectors in the US is the population, you are correct. That is the population. It's the big group. Well, the sub-collection, the sample, were the 30 carbon monoxide detectors that were selected and tested. So we would hope that the 30 carbon monoxide detectors would be representative of the 38 million carbon monoxide detectors. That may seem like a very small sample, and it could very well be. We'll talk about sample size and what's a reasonable sample size as we progress forward in our studies this semester. But if you said 38 million carbon monoxide detectors is the population and the 30 that were selected and tested is the sample, you are absolutely correct. Now, one of the main themes that you'll see throughout the semester in studying this introduction to statistics is sampling methods, and it's almost a focus on the flaws in statistics, but you know that creates bias when you have flaws in the way you collect your data. One very popular way to collect data is by voluntary response. Other sampling methods we'll talk about later in the section, but well, it's discussed later in another section, but voluntary response is flawed. So voluntary response, or a self-selected response sample, it's one in which the respondents decide whether they want to answer the questions or provide results for the survey or not. And sometimes you'll have participants who are very opinionated get involved, and they're very passionate about a subject, and they'll respond, and you miss out on those that are in the middle because they're not going to necessarily want to provide their opinion, and so you get very biased. Most of the time you'll get very biased results. So here are several types of polls that would be voluntary response samples, and they're very seriously flawed, and we have to be careful not to make conclusions about the big population based on the information collected from the sample. So internet polls, where you can click on the little icon to take a survey. How many of you have done that? I usually avoid those. And speaking of the internet, that is the place where a lot of data is collected on users, and those surveys are just an example of it. So although you may not give your name, I would assume they're collecting your IP address. and knowing that, okay, you're, answering this way in this survey, and then depending on the goal of the survey, it may very well be to target some marketing to you based on how you respond, or political views, or provide a feed on your news feed that's very skewed, but based on your typical, potentially your political views or your preferences. Mail-in polls, I don't know that snail mail is really as prolific as it used to be in regards to polls, where people can, fill out a survey and send it in. Although I know my insurance company, they ask me every year to fill out a survey and send it in. And their purposes, of course, will be to verify information about my homeowner's insurance policy. So while that is a voluntary response, they do track it, so it's not anonymous. They track it to me, and they do use that data to make some decisions. Telephone call-in polls, newspapers, print papers aren't as popular as they used to be. Radio's still very popular. And then, television is so different nowadays. I don't know that that's necessarily a way polls are conducted in the our current environment. But radio is popular. Call in your opinion about the political candidates running for office. Who do you think should win and why? Those are the types of voluntary response polls that would give you data that is very biased or considered very biased. So unfortunately, even though it's considered bad practice to use voluntary response samples to make decisions about a population, it is common to do so. Okay, so here's an example. Voluntary response sample versus an example of a sound sampling method. So this is collecting data for the same purpose, but in the first sample, Nightline, it's a TV show, asked viewers to call with their opinion about whether the UN headquarters should remain in the U.S. Viewers then decided themselves whether to call with their opinions, and 67% of 186,000 respondents said that the UN should be moved out of the United States. In the second sample, in a separate independent survey, 500 respondents were randomly selected and surveyed, and 38% of this group wanted the UN to move out of the United States. So you've got two samples. They're collecting data on the same opinion about whether the UN should be moved out of the United States. In sample one, you have some pretty big numbers, right? 186,000 respondents, but they called in with their opinion. Whereas in sample two, the study was conducted where the respondents were randomly selected and surveyed, and you have some results from that group about whether the UN should be moved out of the U.S. So although the two polls produced dramatically different results, the one with the 186,000 those were voluntary response that's a voluntary response sample. And honestly, the smaller poll of 500 randomly selected respondents is probably going to be more likely to provide results based on what the population preference is than the one where the respondents phoned in, which was voluntary response. So the numbers are very different, and the 500 seems like a drop in the bucket compared to 186,000, but it's the way that data is collected that begins to support the representation of the sample. Remember, the sample is what we assume the population is going to, in this case, believe or view as the preference for the UN to move out of the U.S. So in this particular scenario, the 500 would probably be more representative of the population's perspective. So prepare, putting it all together. Remember that what we're discussing in this section is an introduction to statistics, where we think in total about preparing the data and then analyzing the data and then making conclusions about the data. In the prepare category, we want to think about the context of the data, where the data comes from, and how the data was collected. In this particular example, we're going to look at some data and we're going to talk about the context of the data, the source of the data, where it came from, and then how the data was collected, so the soundness of the sampling method, to see if we have data that we can analyze to make some conclusions using it. Context. In the table above, the number of pleasure boats in tens of thousands in Florida is listed in the first row, and the number of manatee fatalities from encounters with boats in Florida is listed in the second row. The format of the table suggests the following, that we want to determine a relationship between the number of pleasure boats that are in use and the number of manatee fatalities. Makes sense, right? They connect in a logical way. What's the source of this data? Well, this data came from the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles and the Florida Marine Research Institute. So the data appears to be, the source of the data appears to be sound and reputable. And then the sampling method. But because the data was obtained from the official government records, we make the determination that it is reliable data. Therefore, the sampling method appears to be sound.